If you do like these tank chats, do please subscribe to the Tank Museum's YouTube channel. This tank chat's going to be about the Soviet era tank, the T-54 and its successor, the T-55. And to look at this tank, like any weapon system, if you don't give a context to it, it's very hard to say anything or judge that weapon system. And with the T-54, we're really looking at a tank that starts its story almost in World War II. It's a bit like the Centurion, and then it goes on for such a long time and has, certainly with the T-54, T-55, so many modifications and so many upgrades and so many variations because of the different countries that's used it over time. It's very hard to be specific, but we're going to start by looking at that context of how and why it was built in the first place, and some later, again, some of those developments that go on through its history, because it's a tank that, even though it dates back to the Second World War, actually it's a tank that's still in service around the world today, and it's probably a vehicle that's seen more action than most post-war tanks. And it's also a vehicle as well that's, quite simply, we haven't got the complete records of how many were built, but we're looking at from about 80 to 100,000 T-54s and T-55s have been built. And if you look at that, that probably means it's the most produced tank of all time. So it's a big story with the T-54 and T-55. So how does it come about? If we go back to the Second World War, if you've watched our tank chat on the T-34, you'll know in that part of the story with the T-34, when they want to move on to a new model tank, they ponder the idea of stopping production and building a new tank, or do they improve on the T-34 with the 76mm gun? Let's build one with a better turret and a bigger gun, and that's the route they choose. They actually go down the route of evolution with the T-34 rather than stopping and starting with a whole new production. But they do develop a replacement tank, and that is known as the T-44 tank. And why the T-44 is really important, it does go into limited production from about 44 to about 49, but it doesn't end up being mass produced in the way that the T-54 is. But a lot of ideas from the T-44 influence the design of the T-54. What are those things? Well, first of all, they start off with an 85mm gun. With some T-44s, they end up then going to a 100mm gun. They even tested a 122mm gun on it. So the firepower's there. The number of rounds carried changes from the T-34-85, but the key elements that look different, the hull becomes wider, the turret becomes wider than what goes on to be the T-34-85, but it's got undercuts either side. But that turret, there are some similarities you can start seeing that we then see appear in the T-54. They take the diesel engine in the back, and instead of being on line with the front of the tank, they actually transversely mount it. So it's going across in the engine bay, and power is taken off that. And again, another key element that you see from the T-44 into the T-54 is the idea of suspension. They change from the T-34's famous Christie suspension, and they go to torsion bar suspension instead. And these elements, they also get rid of, by the way, the co-driver's position that you can see in the T-34-85. That position is actually done away with, and the space next to the driver is used for ammunition or fuel in the T-44. So some of these ideas are picked up on. The T-44, by the way, sees limited service. It's actually there in the invasion of Hungary in 1956. So it's there in the background, but they know that's not the tank. They carry on building the T-34, but they go to that larger turret. That's the tank that really is the vehicle that helps win the war on the Eastern Front for the Russians and the Soviet Union with the Red Army. So what about the T-54? The T-54 is designed, its first kind of iteration comes out. There's a prototype in 45, first limited production in about 46. They build a few of them, and again, it's this Russian idea of experimentation, but it's designed with the Russian idea of how they are going to fight any tank warfare in the future in mind. And this takes us on to the idea of looking at what is that Russian tank philosophy, because so often when we do tank chats, comparing, I've already mentioned the Centurion, is it fair comparisons when we take one type of tank for a certain era, put it up against another without knowing that doctrine, that theory, that thoughts of how it was going to be used behind it? And for the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War, as it's known as there, the Second World War, is hugely influential on their military thought and doctrine after the war. The Red Army never falls out of love with the tank in a way that Western nations have doubts after the war, especially with the idea of new hollow charge weapons being used by an individual. The Soviet Unions, yes, they know about these new weapon systems. They've come up against Panzerfaust, etc. themselves, but they don't have any qualms of continuing a build program to make more tanks, because they think they are going to be fundamental for the Soviet way of warfare for decades to come. So they carry on the design and the development process. And the T-54, by the way, it's designed by the Morozov Bureau out in Kharkov, which is basically in the Ukraine as it would be now, and that tank is designed there. But it's part of a theory and a thought structure that goes on for the 50s, 60s, 70s, which is this longer term Soviet doctrine and aim of what they want for their armed forces. And that, when you look at it, is very different to what becomes the Western or the NATO doctrines, which are very diverse from different countries. They're influenced by new technologies and industries in a way that is just not the case in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union at this time, don't forget, it's command economy, it's based on Marxist-Leninist theory, and it is driven from the top, and doctrine is followed all the way through. And that doctrine of how they're going to fight war is heavily integrated. So the idea of the weapon systems fight together, it is based on what the Red Army thinks are the lessons and the facts learnt from the Second World War. And they actually set up a whole historical study institute. At one point it's got over 1,000 historians and officers in to study warfare, previous warfare, mainly the Great Patriotic War, to learn lessons. Now, some of those lessons, again, for us in the West, they're going to be fairly simple ones, simple things like logistics. How much fuel is an armoured unit going to need if it goes from this distance to that distance? But what the Soviets, they take it a bit further. They do things such as, for example, in a typical meeting engagement, how much artillery fire, how much is needed to suppress an enemy that's of a certain scale for how long. So they know, they actually define all this, and they put it into their doctrine, which becomes their operational art, how they're going to fight. And there's key themes that come out there, one of which is the Soviet belief that attack is the best method of defense. In other words, you don't wait for the enemy to come to you, you try and preempt an attack with your own all the time. Maneuver is highly important to the Soviet army, and they've had these massive advances from 44 onwards to the defeat of the Germans in Berlin in 45. They look at those as models for how they might fight in the future, and that again becomes part of their doctrine. Firing on the move, echeloning their attack. What does that mean? So it means that the unit, the main thrust of the unit is up ahead, but it is followed immediately by further waves of that unit as they're advancing, so that there is a sense of momentum they want to keep in the Soviet army when they attack. And all of these ideas and theories you can see reflect in tanks like the T-54. They are acutely conscious that they have a conscript army that is not going to be very sophisticated in its levels of education. So they want purposely their equipment to be simple to be used, they want it reliable, but they are also adamant that you don't over-optimize things. You don't keep playing with something to make it better and better and better, because they pick up fairly early on, as you can see they've done already with the T-34 tank production. There are lots of things you can do with an armoured vehicle, you can add to, but does it really fundamentally alter the main ability of that vehicle to fight. And of course they contrast that, or we contrast that typically in the West. We could see our tanks in a very different light. The Soviets look at their tanks and think, what's good enough in that role? What meets the requirement, as opposed to in the West, where we're always trying to make things a little bit better, going for that extra percentage all the time. And the Soviets realize that's a rule of diminishing returns. You can spend a huge amount of time getting that extra 5% out of something. Why not actually keep it simple, keep it cheap so we can make more of them? And scale, of course, is vastly important to the Soviet army. The Red Army wants lots of these things. So the fact, again, when we start comparing tanks like the T-54, you have to think of that design philosophy that's behind it, the longer term issues that the Soviet Union, they have the factories, they have design teams that are around for a long time. There is rivalry between the different design bureaus, but actually in the sense of it fits in an overall very well thought through structure that is very different to the Western nations, where different companies are competing, political influence, different technologies come and go, all sorts of things influence that. So that sense of continuity in some of the NATO tank production, etc., is just not there in the same way it is in the Soviet Union. So again, looking at that T-54, the way it fits in with this design philosophy, the fact that it's got a 100mm gun on, that was a very impressive gun when this first goes into production. In the late 1940s, they've done these test ones. Really, it's early in the 1950s that the productions series start coming out. And one of the problems when we're talking about T-54, this one next to me is something that we tend to call a T-54M. It's an improved model. The issue is so often with the T-54, as improvements come out, they're retrofitted to some of the earlier models. And as I mentioned earlier as well, because the T-54 is used by so many countries around the world, that this idea that quite often they adapt or add or change the tanks for their own particular needs. And nowadays, what with upgrade packages, etc., you know, it's very, very hard to find a basic, as it were, T-54 tank. But those early ones, so what is it they're really looking at there? So what we're looking at is a fairly traditional layout in a tank. So what you've got the driver at the front in the driving compartment. He's on one side as you're facing forward. He's on the left-hand side of the tank as you're facing forward. He's got a hatch that lifts up and swings to the side. In front of him, he's got a level of armour protection. They went out to about 98mm on the first model. This model M, it's got extra armour put on later on in its production run. So about 98 of sloped armour at about 58 degrees. So again, it's got good protection on the front there. He has, normally on the very early T-54s, what they did away with the bow machine gunner position. So on this side, there's actually ammunition stowage and fuel as well, just like on that earlier T-44 tank. But instead of having a bow machine gun, they actually have a hole in the front of the glacé with a 7.62 machine gun facing forward. It doesn't actually traverse at all, it just faces forward, and the driver can fire that. He's actually got a lever and a button on one of his driving sticks on the columns there either side, which he uses to actually drive the tank along. So that fires forward. On the turret, you've got here a 3-man turret there, so you've got a 4-man crew overall, and behind where the driver is in the turret, you've got the commander, and the gunner sits ahead of him. Commander has a cupola that can rotate 360 degrees, and again, in simple terms, the method of attack is that the commander will find a target, he initiates a slewing of the turret onto that target, he's got a sight there, it's weaker sight than the gunner then takes over. He's got a sight there which you can do 3.5 magnification, or you turn a button, it goes up to ×7 magnification. He does the fine aiming of this DT-10T gun. It's a 100mm gun, and when it goes into production on a T-54, you've got to remember in the 1950s, this is a very big gun to go on a tank like this, as is the level of armour protection. 1956, when a T-54 is driven into the British Embassy compound in the Hungarian uprising, when the Western intelligence has a chance to have a quick measurement and have a look at this, they are worried by the levels of armour protection on this vehicle, and that actually in Britain initiate the program to develop the L7105 gun, because we don't think our 20-pounder at the time was really going to be up to this sort of thing. So powerful gun. It takes a range of different types of ammunition. Initially, again, as the production one starts off, it isn't stabilized, then they end up by getting stabilization in the vertical plane and then the horizontal plane. Again, a number of those improvements are retrofitted to earlier model T-54s. It's got a range, if it's firing just for high explosives, maximum range about 14,800 meters. It'll go through quite happily something like 185 millimeters of normal steel at about 1,000 meters, firing the standard armor piercing round. And again, different types of round are developed through the T-54. It's got a smoke round, the canister round, rifle gun, by the way, and later on the T-55, they get a missile system called Bastion that can be fired out the end, and it's guided towards the target by a laser sighting system, which is carried on the vehicle as well. So a powerful gun. Later models you end up having your fume extractor at the end of the barrel. This being an earlier 100-meter one, it looks like a long, smooth barrel. There's no muzzle brake on the end or fume extractor there. That commander, he's got a cupola. They started off without the cupola, but then they add a cupola as well for the loader, who's on the other side of the turret. And if you look at that classic turret shape, this what we often called in the West the frying pan shaped turret, at the front of it, it's just over 200 millimeter thick cast armor. So it's got a really impressive frontal armor on the facing to where they expect the enemy to be, up ahead of them. That armor gets thinner in the casting as it goes around the side. Early models were undercut, later models have that classic frying pan oval shape going down to the side, which again, often criticized in the West, you know, the internal volume, the space there is very small, this idea that they're insisting on certain maximum sizes for tank crewmen in the Red Army, and later on obviously in the Warsaw Pact who are also using the T-54 and T-55. That was accepted. That was accepted. The Red Army understands this, that we are going to have a limited space. And in turn, that means the early T-54s have got, they only carry sort of just under 40 rounds. Later in the T-55, just over 40 rounds. That's only the 2/3 of the average ammunition carried by a NATO contemporary tank at the same time. But again, so back to that Soviet philosophy, there's going to be a lot of these. They know they haven't got the same number of rounds they're carrying, but that's perfectly acceptable to them because they know there's going to be more of their tanks coming in the way that they're going to be fighting that way. So armor protection is very good on the front of the turret there. I've mentioned about the loader. He's on this side, gunner on the other side. One way you can identify the earlier T-54s is this mushroom shape, which is in front of the loader's hatch there. That mushroom shape's got an air filter. They do away with that when it comes on later in the T-54 run and onto the T-55. It's a classic, one of those distinguishing features. You can tell the difference between a T-55 and a T-54. 55 loses that mushroom. On the side, you can see on the turret, there's these bars welded on. That's for when you're carrying tank riders, infantry carrying on the side. They've got something to hang on with. And as with so many vehicles I mentioned earlier, the stowage changes because not only is this vehicle made in the Soviet Union, but it's also made in Poland and it's also made in Czechoslovakia. And it's then made in a newer form out in China, because when the Soviet Union and China are buddies at one point, the plans are handed over to the Chinese for the T-54. They make their own version of it, copying it in essence, and that becomes the Type 59 tank. So Chinese copies, Type tanks they're called, so Type 59 is basically a copy of a T-54 built by the Chinese. And they are exported from China all around the world as well. So again, when we're looking at T-54, T-55s, having to look at those nuances of the differences to know that this one is actually made by Norinco Industries in China compared to one made by Poland, where the stowage, again, sometimes the Polish ones have a big box on the turret rather than the traditional arrangements of the stowage that the Soviets are making. The engine in the back with the T-54, it's started normally by electric start. There's a backup compressed gas starting system as a backup. For the 55, it's the other way around. In the T-55, you actually start the engine by using compressed gas. There is a compressor in the T-55, so they think that's a better way of doing it. And there's a backup electric start system as well if needed. That will start this big, what you've got a V54 engine in the back. It's a diesel engine, as I said, mounted transversely. Gearboxes in the rear as well. Drive sprockets at the back. And it goes through a number of different variations on the track, but what is often called in the West aggressive track. It doesn't have rubber pads on it. And again, the Soviets learning again, they've looked at their experience, the idea of the battles they think they're going to have to fight. It's going to be off-road a lot of the time. And again, you only have to think of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, you know, very few metal roads still. They're only being built in larger quantities, roads out there are tarmac roads. And these, you know, they are what they call aggressive track because they will rip up tarmac. But that idea that they're wide to spread the weight on soft ground, thaws, frozen ground, snow, etc. So they're very effective that way. And this system with a dry pin track, you'll hear that same noise that you hear with the T-34, which is the idea the pins are loose. As they go round in the track, if they work their way towards, they can come out one way, that is towards the body of the tank. There is a wedge just before the drive wheel at the back, and that forces that pin back into its lugs, and that's why you always get that classic tap 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 sound as a T-tank's driving around all the time. Fuel on the vehicle, just over half the fuel is stowed under armour, but the Soviets, again, because it's diesel, they pick up on the fact that we're going to do long road marches. They are looking at the logistics, but they want the tanks to be as independent as possible of a major logistics supply chain. So one of the things they do is they add extra drums to the rear of the vehicle, and there's actually fuel containers on the outside on the tin work going up the side. This one's missing one of the containers, but there's normally 4 fuel containers, about 93 litres, in 3 of them of extra diesel. One of those 4 is actually carrying oil for the engine and other components inside the vehicle. So you've actually got fuel on the outside. On the other side, in those metal boxes going down the side, there's basically stowage. So you've got tools, you've got gun kit, you've got, for later models, infrared equipment, which again was fitted to the vehicle later on. So that actually, to help the vehicle see at night when it was firing, they would put an infrared spotlight on the side, and this is certainly on the T-55s, but there's also an infrared headlight in this bracket in the front, because one of the driver's 2 periscopes can be changed for an infrared sight so that he can actually see when he's driving at night as well. And again, back to this philosophy, the Soviet army is looking at keeping momentum going, so it doesn't want to stop for the night. It wants to carry on, keep fighting, keep moving forward in its advance to contact and beyond. Hence, they like the idea of the infrared sighting systems. Now, later, of course, with the sighting I mentioned there, many different countries, over time, these earlier sighting systems are replaced by laser sighting and other ways of doing things. So that technology changes as you look at the tanks going through in the 60s, 70s, and the tanks that are in service still around the world today. So I mentioned the engine, the power pack, and the gearbox is in the back there. There's grills on the top of the engine there for lifting. But one of the things that, again, that is different from the Red Army to when you're looking at NATO countries and tanks, back to that design philosophy, the Red Army sees these tanks as being a weapon that is used in warfare. So often, back in NATO countries, when we design a tank, we're designing it for all that training, etc., that goes on, and the use of it over a long period of time. How do we keep it maintained? So again, it changes slightly throughout the whole Cold War, but really what the Red Army are looking at in the Cold War period is you train on simulators or training tanks, you keep your actual fighting tanks for best. So the idea, they might wear out relatively quickly, they might be fairly simple, they have issues about them, but actually they've thought through that. This is going to be this item that's going to be used in combat, and combat really alone, not for continuously like we do in the West and all those training exercises, etc. that way. So the T-54, it's added to with the T-55, and the real difference there with the T-55, what you're almost looking at is it again part of that Soviet philosophy. The post-war up to about 53, with Stalin still in charge, is almost thinking wartime mentality. Then the Soviets go to a nuclear type mentality, and with the T-54 they start, or the T-55, they start introducing NBC equipment so that the tank can fight later in the 1950s on a nuclear battlefield, and that develops in the 1960s. Later, there's almost, there was early in the 60s and almost an inevitability about the thought it was going to go to chemical or nuclear war if they had actually had to fight with NATO. That changes again, and actually they go back to the idea of, yes, there might be nuclear, but it might be conventional as well, and that changes in how it affects the design. So you're looking at a vehicle that comes in initially about 34 tons, creeps up, T-55 gets to about 40 tons, but that idea of a light, speedy, reliable but simple vehicle built in very large numbers. And I mentioned earlier on, we're looking at about 80 to maybe 100,000 variants or different vehicles actually built. And of course, there are variants as well. We're not going to talk about all of them now, but of course, this becomes a hull that becomes the basis for a bridge layer, an armoured recovery vehicle. Lots of other vehicles are based on the initial hull of a T-54 or T-55 over time. And because there's so many of them, they've been converted. One of the things, well, I mentioned the idea that actually the 55 replaces the T-54 as being wrong, is the Soviet also, the way their system works is it is not like the West, where if, for example, Centurion comes out of service, Chieftain is there and replaces it. Actually, these vehicles work in parallel. So T-54s were still in service with frontline units. This idea that only the frontline unit gets the next best quick, even that was wrong as well. Later model tanks are issued to different types of units across a spectrum. Normally the Soviet look at about 3 categories, you know, for battle ready first line divisions, and they work their way through. But actually the later tanks are sometimes issued to reserve units, not necessarily the frontline ones. So this idea that actually these vehicles are going to complement each other in service, not necessarily the idea that they go out of date and are therefore replaced. And you're talking as well, at one point in the Cold War, we're looking at about 56,000 tanks in the Soviet arsenal. You know, that's a huge number of vehicles if you think of what the size of most modern tank fleets are around the world in these days. Now the T-54, I mentioned this idea, it's still in service, it's gone through lots of upgrades, it's gone through lots of, you can buy on packages. We've actually got a T-55 here that has a British L7105 millimeter gun. Lots of companies have offered upgrades, engine upgrades, technology upgrades, all sorts of things. You can buy your basic tank relatively cheaply, you can spend a lot on it. And one of those other things I'd come back to as well is when we're judging these tanks, as inevitably we do, this idea again, the sort of unfairness of just doing a one-on-one with a NATO Western tank. Yes, most of the time, early days it wasn't the case, but most of the time for the rest of the Cold War, the average NATO tank had a higher specification individually. It might have a more powerful gun, thicker armour, better crew conditions than your standard Soviet tank. But as I mentioned earlier, it was how these tanks were going to be used. And in many ways, the irony, of course, is all of these tanks, despite the fact they've seen huge amounts of combat all around the world in countless wars, we're talking dozens of wars all around the world subsequently, actually they were never really used in the intended way by the Red Army, because fortunately for us that Cold War never became a hot war, and the idea of them being used in the way they were expected to be used and had been designed for to be used never actually occurs. And so again, at the time when tanks like this were used in the Middle East or in other conflicts, and it gave comfort to NATO countries and in the West where we could see they weren't used in the optimum way they were supposed to be used. Quite often they were being knocked out fairly easily at certain times by Western tanks that seemed superior. That didn't really affect the Red Army High Command, because they were looking at that saying, well, that's not how we're going to be using them if and when a hot war starts in Europe at some time. So that didn't affect it. But the irony as well is, even though these items were designed with the idea of conflict in mind for a short period of time to get a resolution on the battlefield for the Red Army. Actually, what happens is these tanks are used in quite often penny packets in wars around the world. They are, because they're simple, actually very reliable, so they seem to go on for a lot longer. They're cheap. If you're going to buy a tank, actually, what can you buy for not that much money? T-54, T-55 fits that category. And the other thing is, as well, is when we look at the tanks and think, well, look, they're old spec, they're this, they're whatever. Some of the places they've been fighting in, actually, having any sort of tank gives you a considerable advantage over your opposition and your enemies. So it's only this idea that in the West, when we're judging a Western main battle tank against a T-54 or T-55, do we think, well, our ones were so much better. Actually, these tanks, in many of the conflicts they've been used in, they are the better tank or the only tank that is being used there. And of course, as anyone will tell you, having any sort of tank is going to give you an advantage. And so however simple, dated, crude they may appear, they can still make a difference on the battlefield, because quite often there isn't a more sophisticated armoured vehicle to fight against them in many of the conflicts they've been in. So these T-54, T-55 tanks are going to be around for, I have to say, I expect decades to come. They're going to carry on being improved on, and there's so many tanks in the modern era, very few countries are building brand new tanks. All they're going to be doing is upgrading a basic chassis of an older tank, adding on extra armour systems, defensive aid suites, all sorts of things, upping the firepower, upping the armour protection. So we will be seeing T-54s and T-55s, I can guarantee you, for decades to come, in action all around the world, even though they are not being used, and they've never really been used for that original Soviet design doctrine in the way that they were going to fight if the Cold War had become a hot war. If you like these films, please do subscribe to the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and if you can, please do support us on Patreon.